of this was for another setting. She didn't do this all since Wednesday afternoon. Okay, Elona did a wonderful job talking about the doctrine of discovery. If you are like me, I never heard about the doctrine of discovery in public school, in college, or in graduate school.
Yeah.
That is a tremendous failing of our educational system. There we go. So this is the outline. What is the doctrine of discovery, particularly in Minnesota? How is it played out? Then really quickly, what is the posture of solidarity? What is decolonization? And then we'll spend more time on following indigenous leadership in Minnesota. So the doctrine of discovery is a really horrible injustice. I'm going to try to demystify that a little bit. Also try to demystify what it means to undo it. Okay. So Elona talked about this. This is a slide from last Sunday. Papal bulls of the 1400s mandated Christian explorers to invade, subdue, vanquish the indigenous peoples, first of Africa and then of the Americas, to reduce them to perpetual slavery and to take all their land and possessions. Now there is an author, a theologian, Willie James Jennings, who recently wrote a book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. And Jennings tells this tale of Zurara, the royal historian for Portugal. This was the mid-1400s. Seeing the suffering of the African slaves, he sheds tears for them. Yet Zurara identifies Christ not with the suffering of the Africans, but with the glorious light of the Europeans compared to the monstrous darkness of the Africans. This is, from a theological point of view, the huge theological mistake that is present in the doctrine of discovery. And of course, when after Columbus, also add the native people of the Americas. So, what is the doctrine of discovery in Minnesota? Well, French explorers discovered the North Shore of Lake Superior and claimed the land for France. And then, after the French and Indian War, which was really the war between the French and the British, after that ended, the British won the war and took control of northeastern Minnesota, but only for 20 years, because after the Revolutionary War, northeastern Minnesota became a territory of the United States. And then in 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase, this huge area that includes 2/3 of Minnesota, became part of the United States. Discovered, claimed by Spain, ceded to France by treaty, and then bought by the United States. And native people say, what? What about us? And then I talked about this a little bit, and Elona did too. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. has absolute title to all land in its boundaries. Indigenous nations only have the right of occupancy, as agreed by the United States government. So that is how treaties were interpreted. Indian Removal Act of 1830, this is the artist's rendition of the Cherokee Trail of Tears. There were dozens of these trails as indigenous peoples were moved from east to west of the Mississippi. And part of the doctrine of discovery and how it played out was the US government and the Minnesota government made treaties to get land. Okay? So part of that treaty making was ignoring leaders who refused to sign to get the land, use the fur trade and debt to get the land, kill buffalo, cause starvation to get the land by trading food rations for land, and use military threat to get land. So a lot of what treaty making was about was land acquisition.
And I shared that some of the very first laws in the colonial powers with Native people were around the sale of alcohol and guns. And there was supposed to be a prohibition of the sale of alcohol because of the immediate effect on our bodies of alcohol. But it was so bad back in the colonial times that that was some of the very first intercourse acts. It was about the sale of alcohol to Native people. And so that was also a tool used for treaty making. When you are not able to discern and participate because you're intoxicated, that's the perfect time to say these people have approved this treaty at this time.
Yeah, and this also was the case in Minnesota. And in 1862 and 1863, the Dakota were intentionally exterminated and removed by the state of Minnesota. This is the quotation from Governor Alexander Ramsey in a speech before the Minnesota State Legislature in 1862. And then the doctrine of discovery plays out through manifest destiny in Minnesota. This was particularly the 1860s, 1870s. Manifest destiny in Minnesota was in full force. And it was driven by the Homestead Act, which made free lands available for hundreds of thousands of families, including my great-grandparents and some of your ancestors, and expansion of the railroad. This is what attracted my great-grandparents from Europe to Minnesota. And Indian boarding schools. There were 16 Indian boarding schools in Minnesota. These were tools of ethnic cleansing. Their objective was the destruction of the culture, language, and spirituality of the indigenous children under their care, usually run by church groups. So this was done in the name of Christianity. And that is the end of that. So, that's a quick run through of kind of what is the doctrine of discovery and how has it played out in Minnesota. So a quick question for your table discussion, it's real quick because we have to keep moving, is which of these is most striking to you? So go ahead and talk about that for, I will say, 6 minutes. So each of you have about 1 minute. Question, which of these is most striking to you?
All of it. You're late, I didn't hear it. Basically, a lot of centered around basically, we find it, and not another self-impression made. And then the last thing we talked about that, I learned about 10 years ago. And that one got the boarding school.
Oh, yeah.
Take children from families.
For some reason, I can remember those.
Huh?
I can remember those for some reason.
They were still around not that long ago.
Yeah, I can still remember them. And, that is atrocious no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean, if they take, I don't know what ethnic group they put into a school like that, it's ridiculous. It's not appropriate. No.
What you guys?
Yeah, I mean, you can't deny that he is, yeah, I mean, it's,
Yeah. My problem is, what are we gonna do? Is there something we can do that makes sense? You know, that's the key in my mind. What makes sense? I mean,
So that your kids are hearing about this, the Doctrine stuff.
Yeah. Not a simple answer to that question.
no, that's the key. There, it isn't.
John, I'm sorry, Russ. Not you, Russ.
Well, I don't want my girls giving even though I was parties.
Hey, now if you can't
Today, of all days.
See that man right there? Teach
Yeah. I went to a church.
Watch this.
You're so silly.
It's not always this intense, but you're gonna start.
Yeah.
It's very progressive.
Yeah, that's what that one was too.
You're smiling.
How old is she? She is 8 months. And then the little guy is almost 3.
Spousal abuse.
See ya.
You know, what are we trying to do?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, does anybody have an idea?
Right now in this discussion.
No, but I mean, just
with
the whole thing in general. What are we trying to do? I mean,
I don't know.
I'm not sure rhetorical question.
I don't know. It's
Okay,
wrong.
let's go on to the next
Right.
section. I'm going to do these two parts together. One is what is the posture of solidarity, and one is what is decolonization. Okay, and these are my perspectives. They are not necessarily the right perspectives, okay? But I share my perspective. Hopefully it is helpful to you. So my perspective on solidarity actually comes from the Indigenous Visioning Circle of Mennonite Central Committee, Central States. I was executive director there for 8 years. We started that Indigenous Visioning Circle. I was a part of it, but really more of a listening part. I did not create this mantra. Really was created by folks like Ruth Yellowhawk and Hurley Eagle. And it is this: to identify and resource indigenous strength and genius while staying on the path of decolonization and relationship. So the first part, to identify and resource. Resource means basically time and money. Okay. Strength and genius. This is a justice-oriented approach. This is not really about actions of charity. Not that they are unimportant, but this solidarity perspective is a justice-focused approach. While staying is an important word there. Many of us who are white are notorious for making long-term commitments to our own predominantly white churches and denominations and organizations. And once in a while, we may make some kind of contribution to an indigenous organization or an African American organization or whatever. This perspective says staying on the path of decolonization and relationship. And we'll get to decolonization, which is for most of us, when I got into it, a pretty mysterious word. Okay? And relationship. Relationship here really means following the indigenous leadership. Okay? That's the kind of relationship we are talking about. So what is decolonization? So this is how I have thought about it. It is not a comprehensive definition by any means, okay? But if we think about major horrible aspects of colonization, that's the left-hand column. It includes massive land theft, genocide, or mass killing, ethnocide, or the intentional destruction of culture, forced removal, and destruction of the environment. Okay? So decolonization then is kind of, let's do the reverse of those. Okay? So it includes land return, peace building, particularly through trauma healing, recovery of culture, language, spiritualities, return from exile, and renewal of the environment. So in my mind, the colonization worldview is white man-centered. The doctrine of discovery is white man-centered. And the decolonization worldview tends to be ecosystem-centered, but of course people are a part of the ecosystem.
What does return from exile mean?
For example, all of the Dakota people were either killed, what Makoche Ikichupi, this Dakota Land Recovery nonprofit organization is returning Dakota people from exile to their homeland. Do you want to say anything more about that? You talked about it a little bit in your sermon.
Well, because there is just so much forced relocation, again, being able to say, can you return to what would have been your historic land base, even if there may not be a reservation there. My people, for example, our reservations were lost, or land reserved for us was gone by the time of the independent war. So again, but our people, my own family, stayed in Delaware. So again, being able to say, this is our homeland territory, and so can we be intentional about welcoming our families back? Can they buy property there? Can they own homes there? Can they set up business there? Can they determine the trade and the tax base for what happens there? That's what the return from exile would be.
Okay. So let's take a few minutes, once again, say 5 or 6 minutes, to discuss this question. I'll put up 2 questions. You choose one or the other. What do you appreciate in my perspectives about solidarity or decolonization? So that's one possible question for you to take a stab at. And the other possible question is, what is missing or what is an alternative perspective? Does that make sense? So let's do a little bit more time on this, let's say 8 minutes. So again, circle this, it's table discussions. Make sure everyone who wants to has a chance to talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just tell us many of the Jones things.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Good to like about. Glad you guys stopped by.
Thank you, yeah. I really like the signs out front, so we finally decided to.
Yeah, I was just telling Russ, you guys picked a position.
It's good.
Oh, that's part of it. Goes to the very intriguing subject. The sign, you know, up front.
Well, I was thinking about renewal of the environment. And I was thinking about the Green New Deal.
We live right in the street. Yeah, and I've lived here, well, we both actually lived here our whole lives. We both went to rental school.
Oh, yeah, huh?
Graduated.
The environment. Trying to
Now we live across the street from my mom and dad in a mile.
Yeah, my
He's really traveled far.
just lives in Egan.
Yeah.
Yeah, he went to Patrick. He got Patrick. I'm trying to think. I think 97. He graduated.
Okay, I was 95.
Really graduated, but, Ryan. Wrestling, played football.
Yeah, wait, is he?
He's an artist.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is he an artist? Yeah. I was friends with him in high school. Him and he's another good friend of mine in the same town.
Yeah.
And I still see them talking.
Yeah. I still speak to Turks and Rock.
Oh, really?
Do you ever watch that show Big Brother?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You know that sometimes during the day they do these comic book covers, you know, superhero kind of things. Rob Miller does those.
Really? So does Tom. I don't know what his last name is now, but Tom and me both. It's funny. They both graduated with me, and they're both very high up in the comic world. So Tom draws.
Yeah, good.
They graduates of Burton High School.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Well, they just don't. He said it last week.
Believe me, you know, how I like to think it's important to get to know each other as well as to talk about the other things.
Just be disconnected from. Yeah.
So you're not a member of the church then?
no, today's the first day we stopped by.
First time?
Yeah.
Hey, good for you guys. I know you're talking, what'd you think?
Oh, I was
Be
telling
honest,
her.
be honest.
No, I am. I was telling her I went to this church for about 10 years maybe, down in Lakeville. It's called Spirit of Joy. That doesn't exist anymore, but this place reminds me so much of that. I love that place.
Spirit of Joy. They came here.
Yes, actually, they lived out their last days here before they gave up.
That was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Years ago. They were, yeah, you had a room down the end.
That's right.
That's part of the reason we have been keeping an eye out, because he moved maybe about 3 years. It was, almost exactly 3 years ago, so it was right when that was happening.
Right around that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we've just been having babies ever since.
Busy having babies ever
Babies
since.
everywhere, so we finally had a...
Is that because you go to this church or something, you have babies, or what's the story?
No, maybe go now. Yeah.
Oh. You guys, I heard you live right around here though, right?
Yeah, right down the street.
Yeah. Okay.
Or walk here.
Yeah. Well, you know, we've been here, you came after we did.
Yeah, I've been here 6 years.
Yeah, we've been here about 7 or 8. Yeah. We thoroughly enjoyed it.
Do you live in Orangeville?
Yeah.
Not far from here. I lived out on Travelers Trail, so just on the other side of the golf course. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So yeah, there's a few people here that live over there in Charlotte.
Okay.
I love her. That's when I got divorced before we met. I love her.
Yeah, it's great.
Very nice.
Just love it in the summertime. Everything is just so beautiful.
I have an 18-year-old. His best friend's uncle is the guy that does all the groundwork there. So yeah, I know how hard he works. So I know
Do you live in a single family house?
Literally just.
You'll almost see it from here, huh?
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
If you went like right through these woods, it's right on the other side.
Okay, this next session, we're actually going to get into the positive part of this. I'm doing the non-synonymous stuff. Or, I don't know, it may be inappropriate, Elona, but redeeming the greater tragedy.
Yes.
Okay. Before we get into the specific areas and people, we know, Elona.
You sound like my mother.
Yeah.
My sister's name was Wando.
Right.
Anna Ramona.
Elona will be sharing some resources, which do have some connections in some of these areas.
Right, they're just not in the sequence. I'm going to stick this under of the list that you got on the board. So if you received a stapled set of materials, I just kind of want to go down those. The first is the documentary done by Sheldon Wolfchild on the Doctrine of Discovery. How many of you have actually seen that? It's been produced by the Dakota 38+2 Productions. There's a YouTube version of it, and it takes about an hour. And I can say I've probably seen it 16 times, and I'm in tears every single time I see that. But I'm going to challenge you with the items that I have here. I would encourage you to at least identify one of these a week between now and the beginning of Lent as a way to educate yourself. So taking some time to start with the documentary. The second is the report from our denomination at the last General Assembly. I have the link to that. This is the entire report that was received by our General Assembly. I was on part of the writing team that prepared this. It gives implications for congregations, presbyteries, and synods. There's also in the footnotes a lot of background material, but that's the second item available to you, and so you can look that up. The next is having become much more acquainted with the work of the Mennonites. I'm from Philadelphia, so I work a lot with Quakers or those people back east. But it's been wonderful to get acquainted with the Mennonites and their resources. So this particular resource is, I call them storyboards, a lot of information on the Doctrine of Discovery that also includes the Delaware Nation or the Lenape people. The next is a video by the Episcopal Church with interviews with Native people. And again, I give you the time on that one, it's not very long. The next item, this crash course on American Indian and Spanish history. I don't know if you've seen this collection. Those of you as educators, maybe you've seen these. They're on YouTube. They're fast. So you have a speaker who's just talking fast and there's images changing, but he gives you the whole context of the discovery of America and Spanish conquest. In that you will just learn so much. Our Minnesota Public Radio and our History Society here in Minnesota had a traveling exhibit called Why Treaties Matter. That is still very relevant, and there's the link to a YouTube on that. When I participated in delivering the blanket exercise, which maybe at some point we can talk about that later, at our Presbyterian Mission Agency, which is the largest entity in the denomination, I used a map which is less than 3 minutes, but it shows you the entire United States as you subtract native land, and then you get these little tiny islands of reservations. That one that week, if you actually follow a discipline of trying to do about one of these a week, that would be pretty amazing for you to see how fast huge tracts of land were lost. Then what we have is Native people, again, trying to follow Native leadership. There was a word association interview that's done around the country, and this is the particular one with Native people on the word reservation. The Doctrine of Discovery, of course, did not just impact North America, Central and South America. Africa and Asia and the islands have also been impacted. And so there is a collection of bones in a museum in New York, just like there have been collections of bones around this country with native bodies from Namibia. And you could see where the German chancellor has declared that the people should not seek reconciliation as they went to claim these bones in New York. So there was a New York Times article about why are there bones in this New York museum. What I've given you here is a link to women who have a traditional outfit that they began wearing from colonial times. So it's not an African-style dress. It's a peasant-looking dress based on what the colonial women were wearing and taught them how to sew. But this discussion for them is as advocates against the genocide of their people in Africa and taking of their bones to be put on display and for research in New York. That's a part of, again, what happened with the Doctrine of Discovery. So you'll see how impactful this has been around the world. The next is, we have native spoken word artist. So this is a favorite of mine. She talks about, you just love you some Indians. That week, just be prepared for her shocking words, because she tells the truth. Nina Berglund and her brother and sister are students from St. Paul's schools. The one sister is in college now. They've been moving on. They were students that went to the Vatican last year, again, to talk about the need for the Vatican itself to address the Doctrine of Discovery. And so this is just a quick video. There's a number of them, of their family around the country as they travel now, as these 3 kids talking about the Doctrine of Discovery. And then finally, I have for you, coming from Canada, and the words to this tune are on the back side of your resource page. But Canada is out of their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, addressing the scoop generation in the 1960s, where Native kids were, again, taken from their families, put in boarding schools, and some never returned. So she's talking about being a witness, and there's now advocacy groups out of the Native community talking about what do we do about the trauma, this generational trauma around losing our children. And her words are very, very relevant. And when you hear this song, she says, your symmetry is unbalanced and unrefined, but you still claim that there's an honor in the crown you take to bed with you each night. So anyway, those are all identified for you, as well as terms. I mentioned to you that our State of the Union addresses in the past were oftentimes to identify the need for Indian removal. I'll just give you one quote I've talked to you about with Jackson a little bit more, but let me share one from Grover Cleveland, who said, when the existing system was adopted, the Indian race was outside of the limits of organized states and territories. If you think the discussion of the Civil War around states' rights is in the past, it actually was preceded because of native rights. And it's still relevant today. But he says, and beyond the immediate reach and operation of civilization, and all efforts were mainly directed to the maintenance of friendly relations and the preservation of peace and quiet on the frontier. That means shoot us so we won't be there to bother you. All this is now changed. There is no such thing as the Indian frontier. Civilization, with the busy hum of industry and the influence of Christianity, this is our president in a State of the Union address, surrounds these people at every point. None of the tribes are outside of the bounds of organized government and society, except that the territory system has not been extended over that portion of the country known as Indian Territory. As a race, the Indians are no longer hostile, but may be considered as submissive to the control of the government. We went from being allies to then your enemies, to then being declared hostile, to the point of being submissive and invisible. So if you want to continue to look at some of the historical things, I can talk, anybody who wants to talk with me about that, I can. I also brought a copy of the written apology that was offered from the denomination. And it just simply begins, we apologize for the pain and suffering our church's involvement in the Indian boarding school system has caused. To those individuals who were physically, sexually, and emotionally abused as students of Indian boarding schools in which the Presbyterian Church was involved, we offer you our most sincere apology. You did nothing wrong. You were and are the victims of evil acts that cannot, under any circumstances, be justified or excused. And then it goes on to say, we seek God's forgiveness, healing grace, and guidance. It's a whole statement. However, part of the response up in Alaska was, who are these people coming to give us this apology? We did not do the work that we needed to do to even prepare an event or an apology. So sometimes Native people see that apologies are offered because white people and the church want to ask for forgiveness. It's not that they're really repentant. And then last, of course, there's always brand new stuff. I just saw that the St. Paul Public Library has a fireside reading series, and coming up on February 20th at the Hamlin Midway Library on Minnehaha is going to be Martin Case as a speaker. His book is The Relentless Business of Treaties, How Indigenous Land Became U.S. Property. I also have shared with John, I just got these in the mail Friday, so I haven't read them yet. There's a book called White Birch, Red Hawthorne, by Nora Murphy, who's a grant writer for a number of Indian-run and led organizations. She's a white woman, saying now, I'm beginning to understand my presence as a significant figure in the American Indian community raising resources is also one about taking responsibilities for my family's complicity with land grab and the destruction of the ecological systems. Also, Anne Poole, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, she wrote Brokeback Mountain. This is her book called Dark Skins, or Bark Skins, excuse me, about loggers around the world destroying, so the deforestation of the world. This is brand new, at least for me, and so I brought that in case anybody wanted at least to flip through it and write it down. And then finally, last night I also came across a news article in Kansas, and how now, 5 generations later, the daughters have sold the farm and returned $10,000 to the Heritage Foundation of the local tribe. As a people, they don't exist the same way, but there is a Heritage Foundation for the preservation of their values. And so here's a story that just came out. Yep. Groneman was the family name, and she just said, she wrote the Kansa, which where we get the name of the state. She wrote them and said, there's so much grief in this land. I want to be able to do what we can now that we have inherited and we've been responsible for the sale. So this is happening all over.
Thank you. So you see up here 5 areas of undoing the doctrine of discovery and indigenous leaders in each area, most of them in Minnesota. Okay. I'm going to just go through these real fast, and then the question for your tables is going to be, which of these areas most resonates with you? So the first one, well, it's Elona. Faith communities. By the way, these 9 faces are the tip of the iceberg. Okay. Education, Sheldon Wolfchild, What is the Doctrine of Discovery? That film, Elona mentioned, that's available on YouTube. It is excellent. I've only seen it 3 times. You're way ahead. Legal system for the U.S. law, Stephen Newcomb is one of the leading experts on this. I think the leading expert. He is Shawnee and Lenape. I think Lenape, Delaware are interchangeable. Yes. Indigenous Law Institute. For each one, I put the web address if you want to look it up. Financial systems. Sarah Augustine was Pueblo, lives in Washington State. She is Mennonite. She got involved with the Wayana people in Suriname, who are experiencing ecological destruction and destruction of the people through mercury poisoning as a result of gold mines. And this is being financed as development by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and our retirement funds. So how the doctrine of discovery plays itself out in financial systems around the world. WAS, Dakota generations. Talked about that a lot last week. I'm going to let you talk about these next two.
Talk a lot about intergenerational trauma and how even with scientific studies it shows that children who have been raised in traumatic situations or ACE, adverse childhood experiences, that actually affects not only your DNA but your brain development. And so Sandy Whitehawk is a number of people in this generation who were adopted out. You know, Native American children have the highest out-of-home placement for foster care and adoption in the United States of any portion of the population. And which is why we have the Indian Child Welfare Act in the 1970s. But anyway, in her situation, because she was adopted and she works now as the grief counseling around trauma, she's working very hard to be able to say those families that experienced the boarding school, even if it was your great-grandmother, your entire family is now impacted by that because it interrupted the transfer of values and knowledge within your family unit to succeeding generations. And so that's why her work is very important, and it's a first-person experience for her because she was adopted. We have a number of people coming out of the state of Minnesota that said, why should degrees in language only be European languages? You know, if you already speak, if you're bilingual with your native language, I think that shows a competency. So Anton Truer is one of the individuals working with Bemidji State University who does the graduate level work around Ojibwe. There are a number of people who actually are doing this so that you can be certified to teach Ojibwe, not just in high schools, but be able for corporate work as well. And so he's a phenomenal speaker. He wrote this book, Everything You Want to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. He's got 9 kids and he's a runner. So I don't know where he gets time to even write a book. But this again is this current generation of Native leaders who are being able to say, we have everything we need inside us already. Just listen to us, share the information that we have.
On Anton Troyer's website, he's written 14 books. So I talk, where is the time? In the environment, the none of the Duke, honor the earth. And finally, sacred sites, protecting sacred sites, telling stories of sacred sites. Jim Bear Jacobs. There is the web address. If you are interested, anybody or people from his church, to participate in a historic sites tour.
Which is just around here.
Just around the Twin Cities area. Jim Bear Jacobs and Bob Kleiner who read those. They are excellent. I can help make arrangements so you can contact Jim Bear directly. There's the web address there. Okay, so I'm a little bit over time, but I want you to have an opportunity to just go around your tables and answer this question. Which of these areas resonates most with you? And my finding is that most people find something about undoing the doctrine of discovery that resonates most with them. Maybe more than one, but just say one. Which of these areas resonates most with you? And then make a note of the person, the indigenous person, and then the web address. You can find out more about it. So go ahead, and then we'll finish this in about 6 minutes.
Children. I was a single mom for a while, and I can't imagine, you know,
My question is, and I'm sure that the big answer here that is going on, what do the native people themselves want in the spring? Where's it going? Right? The discovery, all that stuff. What do they want? Where do we go? What's the story here? We can sit around and, as far as I'm concerned, you know, valid points, valid point, valid point, valid points. What do they want? Let's take it from there. I mean, I'm not good at discussing theoretical things.
You want to do like action?
Yeah. I mean, I just, you know.
Give it the bottom one.
Historic sites, or whatever they call them,
What about you, Jenny?
native sites, we could actually do tourist places,
Yeah, I mean,
learn more about.
What?
how I feel.
In what?
I'm not interested in any of I mean, if you're disrespectful, there's incidents and cases where all this stuff happened all the time. I mean, the world is.
I think that would be something that we could do as a conversation.
It's all bad. And, but I don't see it.
But that's something that
There was like
certain things will resonate with certain
they're doing the same thing now with kids that are being separated from their parents and put into, you know, the exact same situation. Sure. We're going here and nobody's taking any of it and learning from it. They're just doing the same thing again. That's where this stuff should matter because if you see that there were wrongs done, that's not guilty for them, but those changes.
That was one. The land returns is probably the most fascinating to me because what would that look like and how would that work? It's kind of fascinating. That you want to see uprising. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, but I'm with you.
And yet,
No.
land ownership is such an important part of building wealth. Yeah, it is. So the effects of that being taken,
We'll give you about one more minute or another
even
quarter
that
to
model
snow.
still has an effect today. But then the other one, the other part of it, I learned about a lot of stuff.
in appearance.
That I didn't know about some of that. So much of it, like boarding school. What they did. That was like so shocking to me. How could I never known this?
It was an evil time.
Yeah.
But if you really want to, well, maybe you read a good book. I learned a lot from this too. 1491. You read that book? You know, she was the vice president. Yeah, it was basically about what the South America was like before. And there was a lot of people here, and you know, but disease wiped out.
What?
Disease was particularly smallpox.
I'll continue to do the good work that you can.
Yeah, that's right.
It does take a lot of gaining knowledge. It takes a lot of listening. It takes a lot of being in, what did you say, staying? You know, staying in those places where you may be uncomfortable. But it is something that we need to do for healing and repairing the breach because so much has been broken and torn apart. As I close, I would just hope we recognize that this is global in nature. The greater tragedy was global. It was not just somebody dividing the world with a pencil on a map, but it means that on every continent, the Doctrine of Dominion has determined what people survived, what people were reduced to poverty because they were denied access to their own resources and sustainable lifestyles. I was just thinking again that at the United Nations we continue to have indigenous people who present rights and want that those resolutions approved at the United Nations. And it tends to be the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada that often are the ones that say no to indigenous rights. And I'm also realizing that the world's areas of crisis often were established by colonial powers sitting miles away from a continent, dividing up the spoils of land. And so I had a note from a fellow over the weekend wanting me to be able to come share the Doctrine of Discovery with their group. They're here as part of the presbytery. They have the Ethiopian worshiping community, but the people there are Anuak, Oromo, who would be like the indigenous people in the Ethiopian region, Ethiopians, and Somali people. And we know that the Ethiopian civil war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, that is a result of colonialism and is still impacting not just refugees and people in camps today, but what he was telling me is that when their people now want to be able to go home because they've been here in the United States and bring resources to their families back home, the Sudanese people have been invited, they've been relocated to their home territory, and they're now possessing the land. So we've got people in our schools, we've got children of generations of people who have been political enemies or, in opposition because of colonial government powers. And now we have them all in our classrooms. Pray for teachers every day, because their message is about being able to understand the trauma of this injustice. We know that every time there's been a relocation and a reparation agenda, here in the United States, of course, when in the Second World War, when Japanese Americans were put in camps, many of those camps were on native reservations. And including the people up in Alaska on the St. Lawrence Island who are indigenous people, they were interred also. Because what? Their home was the St. Lawrence Island, part of the bridge between the polar cap and the United States, and it was a military precaution. So they removed native people from St. Lawrence Island. These are people that still were traveling by dog sled. So again, I think for us to understand the the global implications of the Doctrine of Discovery, the tragedy is just so great. So you do need a spiritual response as well as an economic and political justice response. So that's what I would encourage you to do. You have to be strong, you have to listen and learn, and we have to understand that these are not things that we can just offer apologies about and say we're sorry. It really is going to have to get us in places where we actually begin repairing. So that's all I would have to say. Thank you. Good.